Alright guys, thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be covering the exposure triangle. We're going to be looking at the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed, and how all of that controls the light that comes into your camera. I encourage everyone to take a pencil or a pen and follow along, draw the exposure triangle with me, and hopefully you take something from this video. So we're going to start with the triangle. And so one way that I like to remember the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed is to think alligators in sewers. So here we are, alligators in sewers. So if we look at the A, that is for aperture, and we look at the I, that is for ISO, and then we also have the shutter speed. Each one of these plays into correctly exposing your image. So as we look at the aperture, we're going to see some f-stop numbers. So let's go ahead and start with, we're going to look at this going clockwise, and as you look at that, we're going to be gaining more light. So we're going to go ahead and say more light here. If you start increasing your aperture or opening up your aperture, you are going to be gaining more light. So from f16 to f1.8, you're going to be gaining more light as you start opening up that aperture. The next one we're looking at is the ISO. You're going to be gaining more light as well as you continue to move clockwise here on this triangle. So if you start at ISO 100 and you continue to move forward, so as you begin to move from ISO 100 and you start to increase that sensitivity here to 3200, you're going to be gaining more light as well on this one. And now let's look at the shutter speed. We're still going clockwise, so we're going to be moving this way, and this should have been red. So now let's go ahead and look at the shutter speed here, and we're going to start at 1/4000th of a second, and then 1/2000th of a second. So this is your shutter speed, and as we begin to move, as we start going clockwise, we are gaining more light. And so the same thing happens as you go counterclockwise. So let's go ahead and start on our shutter speed. As you start to have your shutter speed increase, then you're going to be getting less light. And same thing with your ISO. As you begin to reduce the ISO, there is going to be less light for your image. And the same thing here with the aperture. As you start to go down, as you start to close up your aperture, and we're going to try to keep this as simple as possible, but here are a few other things that the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed control other than just the light. So on your aperture, one of the things that the f-stop controls is the depth of field. So that is if you want to get more in focus or if you want to separate your subject from your background. So at f16, let's say that you want everything in focus. You have your subject, and then you are going to have something in the background. It is also going to be more in focus. But as you start to open up your aperture, you're going to have your subject in focus, and then your tree back here is going to be just a little bit blurrier. It's going to be blurrier on the background. So this is supposed to be a blurry tree, and it just looks like a blob, but it's supposed to be blurrier. So you get a blurrier background as you start to open up your aperture here. When you have your lens wide open, it looks something like this. This aperture here is going to allow as much light in as possible, and when you begin to stop down, you begin to lose half as much light, and notice what happens to your aperture as that f-stop begins to stop down. It gets smaller and smaller, so it allows less and less light in. So at f16 you're going to have a smaller aperture, and at f1.8 you're going to have a wider aperture. So wider apertures allow for blurrier backgrounds, and when you stop down to a smaller aperture, at an aperture like this, you're going to get mostly everything in focus. And with the ISO, when you have an ISO at 100, your image is going to be nice and clean. And as you begin to push that ISO higher and higher, your image is going to become almost pixelated or just grainy. And it's not going to be as clear, as clean, or as sharp. It's going to be almost grainy, as if it was made out of sand. And it's not as clean as if you were shooting at a lower ISO. And this here is going to represent the camera sensor. And each sensor behaves a little bit differently with light. So newer sensors are going to be better in low light situations as opposed to older sensors in most cases. Anytime that you start to increase your ISO, it's going to become grainier because it's really pushing the sensor. It's really pushing what the camera sensor can do. So it's really all about computing power in this case, and just the way that it registers all the light. And then finally, if we look at the shutter speed here, a faster shutter speed is going to freeze your action. So I'm going to attempt to draw an ice cube here. And a slower shutter speed, you're going to actually start seeing motion. So let me attempt to draw a fan here. And I'm just going to show this fan moving here because it's showing motion. So when would you want a slower shutter speed? A slower shutter speed might show motion. So let's say you want to see a tennis racket actually moving instead of being frozen. You can slow down your shutter speed there. Let's say that this represents the shutter, and so the shutter on the camera comes from the top and then it comes down, and then this section here is the section where the light is going to come through the lens and it's going to expose the sensor. And so when the shutter is released, let's say that you are at 1/60th of a second, the shutter speed is going to move down a lot slower than if we were at 1/4000th of a second. It's going to allow less light to come onto the sensor because it's going to expose it for less time. So for example, if it's at 1/4000th of a second, it might just go really quickly up and down like so, and it doesn't really have a lot of light. So the faster you shoot on that shutter speed, the less light that it's going to have. And so at times when you're trying to shoot some stars or do astrophotography, you can keep that shutter open for longer periods of time. And any time that we begin to change the aperture, the ISO, or the shutter speed, there's something that's called stops. So let's say that you go from f16 to f11, you are actually gaining twice as much light. Each time you change your aperture, you gain a full stop of light. Let's say that you are changing it from f8 to f5.6, you are gaining a full stop of light. And vice versa, if you're going backwards, if you're going the opposite direction from f2.8 to f4, you're actually losing half as much light. And the same concept goes with the ISO. So when you go from ISO 100 to 200, you're gaining twice as much light, or a full stop. You're moving a full stop. And the same thing with the shutter speed. So the slower the shutter speed, the more light you gain. So when you go from 1 2,000th of a second to 1/1000th, you are actually going changing your shutter speed by a full stop, or gaining twice as much light. And if you go backwards, where you're losing light, you are going by a full stop as well, from 1/250th of a second to 1/500th of a second. You're actually losing half as much light as you are doing that. So all of these here are written in full stops, and most cameras will not be changing any of these settings by full stops, but by like 1/3 of a stop or 2/3 of a stop. So you can also adjust that in your camera. So that was it for the exposure triangle, and so I'm going to make this available to be printed off, so that way on our next video we can go ahead and use this page to make it practical. Okay, so this is all theory and it's great to know this. Okay, show me how I can use this. So on our next video, I'm going to go ahead and show an image that is overexposed, and then we're going to correct it. And then we're going to show an image that is too dark, and we're going to go ahead and correct it. And so once you can understand the exposure triangle, you understand the foundation of photography. And once you can understand how the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed control your light, and what each one of these does for your images, then you can shoot in full manual and shoot like a pro. So alright, that was it for today, and hopefully you learned something. And if you like the content of this channel and you're learning lots, go ahead and support my channel by subscribing, and we'll see you on the next video. Until next time.